You have arrived at Olympus Dreams, and tonight the sky holds something luminous for you. Settle into stillness now as we drift toward the beginning of a goddess made entirely of light. There is a memory I return to more than any other, not the long crossing of the sky, not the cold pull of the witches below, or the negotiations I made in marble halls on Olympus. No. The memory I return to is simpler than all of those. It is the three of us, together in the halls of our parents, before the sky required anything of us at all. Hyperion's palace does not sit in a place that mortal maps could name. It exists somewhere between the edge of the ocean and the first breath of morning, where the light does not belong to any hour yet, but contains all hours within it. The walls hold a warmth that comes from no fire. The floors carry a soft luminescence, as though the stone itself remembered sunlight long after the sun had gone. My father made this place from what he was, and it showed in every surface. I was young then, if youth means anything for a being like me. Time sits differently on a Titaness. But there is a quality to early existence that I recognize now as youth, a softness in the edges, a brightness that had not yet learned to be careful with itself. My brother Helios was already golden even then. He moved through rooms the way flame moves, with direction and heat, his presence filling whatever space he entered. He was not unkind in this. It was simply his nature to be large with light. I would watch him from doorways sometimes, practicing the arc of his arm, the way he would later practice the arc of his chariot across the sky, and I understood even then that the two of us were made for different hours. Eos was something else again. She woke before either of us, always. I would find her at the eastern windows of our parents' palace before anyone else had stirred, her fingers trailing in the air outside as though feeling for something the rest of us could not detect. She had a particular silence in those early moments, a gathered quality, like breath held before a word. When she finally moved, when morning colour began to spread from her in pink and gold, it was like watching something unclench, like watching a fist open into a hand. We three were always in this order. Eos, then Helios, then me. It was not a ranking, it was a rhythm. Our mother Theia understood this. She would sit with us in the evenings and let us watch as the light changed above the ocean, pointing to the transitions, the moments when one of us ended and another began. She was teaching us, I realize now, teaching us the boundaries of our own natures. She has the patience of deep stone, my mother. Her eyes carry a brightness that is not borrowed from any of us. It is older, more constant. When Hyperion named her Theia, the Divine One, the Shining, he was not exaggerating. She is one of those beings who carries her own source. I remember one particular evening, the three of us seated around her in the great hall. Helios was restless. In that way he had, moving even when still, one knee lifted, fingers drumming a rhythm I could never identify. Eos was watching the window. I was sitting close to our mother, which was where I usually was. Theia was explaining something about the ocean that surrounds the world, the great river Oceanus, and how each of us would dip below its edge each day or night, would cross beneath the world in our cups or our boats, or however she chose to describe the return, and rise again on the far side to begin our arc once more. Helios asked if it was cold beneath. He had the directness of someone who had not yet learned that some questions are better left unasked. Theia smiled. She said, "It is dark, but you will carry enough light that you will not notice." I remember thinking about that answer for a long time afterward. The idea that light could substitute for warmth, that carrying enough of it would keep you from feeling the cold of the dark passage beneath the world. I was not certain even then that I believed her, but I remember wanting to. Eos said nothing. She had fallen asleep against a pillar, which was unusual because Eos was not someone who slept easily. When we noticed, we let her alone. Her face in rest had a looser quality than her face in waking. Less becoming, more simply being. Helios looked at her and then at me. There was something in his expression that I have tried many times to translate into words. It was not quite tenderness, though there was tenderness in it. It was more like recognition, as if he were seeing something he had known for a very long time and was only now fully acknowledging. He said quietly, "So as not to wake her, we will not see each other much once we begin." He meant the sky. He meant the simple physics of our duties, that he would rise as I descended, that our crossings would be forever at the edges of the day, brief meetings at the horizon where gold and silver touched for only a moment before separating again. I knew it was true. Thea had explained as much, though gently, in the manner of someone who understands that certain truths need to be placed softly into young hands before they can be held. I said, "We will see each other at the horizon." He nodded once, looking out toward the ocean. That pale gold of his seemed to deepen for a moment, or perhaps it was only the hour, the last of the evening light thickening before it released the sky to me. That conversation has stayed with me across all the crossings I have made since then, not because it was profound exactly, but because it was the last time the three of us were simply ourselves together, before the sky had any claim on us, before our light had a direction or a purpose, before we became our duties. In the morning, which arrived as all mornings arrived in that palace, with Eos rising before any of us expected her and spreading pink light through every window, Hyperion came to us. He had our crowns. Helios received his first, a blazing crown of gold that, once placed, did not rest on his head so much as become his head, absorbing into the light he already was. Then Eos received her crown, and she was already walking toward the eastern door before he had finished placing it. Then my father turned to me. He held the crescent crown between his hands carefully, as though it were not metal at all, but something less solid, something that required delicacy. The silver of it caught the last of the morning light. Eos had left behind and held it differently, cooler, more patient. He placed it on my brow. I remember the weight of it, not heavy, but present. The way a hand on your shoulder is present, not pressing, just there, reminding you of something. He said nothing. My father rarely used words when a gesture would serve. He looked at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I could see the reflection of something luminous and quiet, looking back. I understood. The night sky was mine, and I was its. My brother was already gone toward the east. My sister was already spreading gold across the horizon. And I was the one who would wait, who would gather the world's light after they had finished with it, and pour it back gently, softly, across everything they had left behind. I lifted my face toward the sky above the palace, and began to understand, for the first time, the specific loneliness of moonlight. The first crossing was not what I had imagined. I had thought it would feel like something decisive. A beginning with a clear edge to it, the way a door sounds different when you close it behind you for the last time. But when I first stepped into my chariot, and the white horses lifted their heads and began to move, it was quiet, ordinary almost. The sky simply opened around me, the way a dark room accepts a lamp brought into it, without ceremony, without comment. My horses knew the path. I did not have to guide them. They carried me eastward along the arc my father had shown me once, a single afternoon, his hand tracing the line through the air above the palace roof. "This is your arc," he said. "You will find it instinctively." And he was right, which should have been comforting, and was, and also was not. What I had not anticipated was the view. From that height, the world below was vast and still, darkened coasts, rivers catching my light and holding it briefly before releasing it downstream, trees that moved in winds I could not feel from where I sat, and the absence of my brother everywhere because he had just descended. The sky still held the faint memory of his warmth, the way a stone holds heat after the sun has moved off it. But it was cooling rapidly, and I was the only light crossing that dark expanse. I held my reins and looked down and tried to feel something complete, What I felt instead was the beginning of a question I could not yet form into words. I crossed. I reached the western edge where Oceanus lay waiting, that great silver river that encircles everything. My horses descended without my asking them to, and we dipped below into the cold passage beneath the world. Theia had said, "You will carry enough light that you will not notice." I noticed. It was not unbearable. I want to be accurate about that. The passage beneath the world has its own quality, something hushed and ancient, water and stone and a darkness so complete that my own silver light seemed very small inside it. But I was not afraid. More than anything, I was aware of myself in a way I had not been before, the isolation of it. The sense of being a specific, singular thing in a vast, dark space, with no one else near, with no one to look at and gauge whether you were managing it correctly. I came up on the other side. Dawn was already beginning, Eos spreading her colour across the eastern sky in advance of our brother. She had been at it for some time. The horizon was layered in rose and amber, and that pale gold that precedes Helios, and it was already beautiful, the way her mornings always were. I descended toward the edge of the world and brought my chariot to rest. Helios was rising. I could feel him before I could see him, the warmth of him moving up through the air ahead of his chariot. And then there he was, gold already blazing even in those first moments of ascent, his horses pulling against the harness with an eagerness mine never quite had. He was moving fast, the way he always moved, as though the sky owed him nothing and he owed it everything. He saw me. He did not stop. Neither of us could stop. That was the nature of what we were, but he slowed, slightly, fractionally, enough that I could see his face clearly as he passed. That familiar gold of him, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes, when they found mine, carried something I recognized as what he had felt the night before in the palace but could not say. He lifted one hand from the reins. That was all. Just that. One hand raised for a moment before the arc of his crossing pulled him upward, and the brightness of him became too much to look at directly, and I had to lower my gaze. The horizon was briefly both of us together, gold and silver, his light and mine, overlapping for that small fraction of morning before they diverged. It lasted perhaps 20 heartbeats. It may have lasted less. Then he was up and I was down, and the sky between us was growing wider by the moment, as it would every morning, as it would across all the days that followed. I stood beside my chariot at the edge of Oceanus, and watched the world brighten without me. That was the loneliness I had begun to understand the morning of the crowning. Not grief exactly, not the sharp kind of loss that comes from a thing taken. More like the specific ache of proximity without presence. Helios was there, above me, his light filling the whole of the sky. And yet he was as unreachable as if he had been in another world entirely. The 30 or 40 years that followed, in the reckoning of mortals, settled into a rhythm I learned to inhabit. Night after night I crossed. The world below changed slowly. Cities grew at their harbours. New islands emerged where the sea had decided to rest. I watched all of it from the arc of my chariot, and in time the watching itself became familiar, the pleasure of a consistent vantage point. The strange comfort of seeing everything while being seen by nothing that could speak back. I tried to find Eos at the horizon each morning, as well as Helios. She was harder to locate precisely. Her colour spread so widely in advance of her that I was often already descending before I could identify where she herself was within it. Occasionally I caught a glimpse of her chariot moving fast along the lower arc. She never seemed to slow the way Helios did. She was intent on her own path with a focus I respected and could not always match. My brother and I developed our own wordless vocabulary at those brief horizon crossings. The angle of his head, whether his hand was lifted or at his side. Once he turned in his chariot and looked back down the arc at me, and that looking back, which must have cost him some effort against the pull of his course, meant something I understood without being able to say what it was. We were not separated the way grief separates people. We were separated the way geometry separates things. The structure of the sky itself had placed us on opposite arms of the same circle, necessary to each other's existence and perpetually out of reach. This is what it is to be the moon, not darkness, not the absence of the sun. My light comes from no internal fire of my own. I carry what the world has already given and return it, softened, to the dark. I am the pause between one brightness and the next. And the pause, I came to understand slowly over many crossings, is not nothing. The pause is where the world breathes. But in those first years I had not yet arrived at that understanding. I had only the crossing and the horizon and the single moment of gold and silver overlap that passed before I was ready for it to be finished. I remember looking up sometimes from the passage beneath Oceanus and thinking of Helios somewhere far above, alone in his blazing arc across the day, and feeling something that was almost relief, almost solidarity. We were each alone in our own sky. That was not a personal affliction. It was the structure we had been given. That helped. Knowing it was the structure rather than something that might have been otherwise. Though I will admit, knowing a thing and being at peace with it are not always the same crossing. There was a night, early in those years of settled rhythm, when something shifted in the crossing. I cannot say exactly when it was. My memory of it does not come attached to a season or a year. It comes attached to a feeling, the way certain memories do, arriving complete and out of order, belonging more to the body than to any calendar. The horses had been moving at their usual pace. The world below was dark and quiet, the cities sleeping, the harbours still. My light lay across the water in long silver panels, tilting slightly as I moved overhead. I was perhaps midway through my arc, not yet beginning the long descent toward the western edge, but past the highest point of my crossing, where the sky opens widest and I can see the most of the world at once. I was looking down, as I often did in those years, watching the particular way my light settled over different surfaces. Stone and water received it differently. Stone held it briefly and then released it. Water kept moving, and so the light kept moving with it. I found that distinction interesting in a quiet way. The sort of noticing that fills long crossings without demanding too much thought. That night I let my gaze drift southward and east. There were mountains there I had not paid particular attention to before, low ranges along a coastline, dark against a darker sea, their shapes familiar but unnamed in my mind. I had passed over them many times. They were simply part of the texture of the world, one feature among thousands. But that night something drew my attention to one hill in particular. It was not large, not dramatic, the way some mountains are, with sharp ridges that catch light from a distance. It was a rounded hill, gentle-shouldered, covered in what I understood from my height to be low scrub and pale grass. The coast curved behind it. The sea below was calm. I noticed the hill, and then I noticed something on it. A shape, small from my height. A mortal, lying on the hillside in the posture of sleep, arms loose at the sides, face turned upward. I have seen countless sleeping mortals from above. There is nothing unusual in that. The world below me at night is full of sleep, whole cities given over to it, fields and roadsides scattered with it. A sleeping figure is among the most common things I pass over, but I slowed. Not intentionally, not by any decision I was aware of making. My horses did not slow, the arc did not slow, and yet something in me pulled against the pace, not enough to change it, but enough that I noticed the pull. I looked at the figure below for longer than I would have otherwise. Long enough to see, though the distance was great, that there was something in the stillness of him that was different from ordinary sleep. Most sleeping mortals shift. They turn. Even in deep sleep the body makes small adjustments, settling and resettling. This figure was entirely still, perfectly still, in a way that suggested not mere sleep, but something closer to peace. An absolute, uncomplicated rest that I had no name for. I passed over. The hill fell behind me. The coastline receded. I continued my descent toward the western Oceanus, and my horses moved without hesitation through the familiar arc, and the moment closed behind me as moments do. But it stayed. That is the strange thing. Moments that are warnings do not announce themselves as warnings. They arrive looking like nothing. A hill seen from a great height, a still figure in pale grass. A pull against the pace that resolved into nothing, that changed nothing about the crossing. I went on. I descended. I passed beneath the world, through the cold dark beneath Oceanus, my silver light dim in that stone and water passage. And I came up again on the eastern side into the next night, and I rose. Nothing had changed. Everything continued, and yet the hill stayed with me through the passage. It was there in the dark beneath the world, that rounded shape against the coastal sea, that impossible stillness of the figure on the slope. I could not have told you why I kept returning to it in thought. There was nothing in it to explain. A sleeping mortal on a hillside in Caria. That is all it was. I did not look for it on the next crossing. Or if I did not find it. My arc does not follow precisely the same path each night. The angle shifts. Some features of the world come into my view and then recede for many nights before returning. The hill came back to me in glimpses. 3 or 4 crossings across what must have been a great span of seasons. Each time I found myself slowing in that part of my descent, not much, not in any way that could be called a true alteration of my course. Enough to look. He was there each time, always in the same posture. That same absolute stillness. The pale grass of the hillside around him, the dark sea below, the mountain's rounded shoulder framing his rest. From my height I could not see his face clearly. I could see only the general shape of a young man, the particular quality of his repose. I did not understand what I was noticing. I only knew that I noticed it. There is a feeling that comes before love, if love is what it was, and I am still not certain I have found the right word for what that hill became to me. The feeling is not yet longing. It is not yet recognition. It is something quieter than either of those. It is the sense that something ahead of you in time has already cast its shadow backward, and you are standing in that shadow now, and you do not yet know what made it. I was standing in the shadow of something I had not yet arrived at. The hill had a name. I would learn it later. Mount Latmos. A name that would come to mean more to me than most names in the world, though in those early crossings it was simply a shape against the sea, and the figure on it was simply a figure, and the pull I felt when I passed overhead was simply unexplained. I think of it now. That early time before I knew him, before I had descended, before any of it, and I feel the particular strangeness of memory that knows what the moment did not. I was so far above, the world was so far below. And somewhere on that hillside, in sleep so complete it seemed made rather than fallen into, he lay waiting, though he did not know he was waiting. And I passed over him. Night after night I passed over him. My light fell on his face in the dark. I did not know then what that meant. I only knew there was a hill in Caria. I kept returning to in thought, long after the crossing had carried me past it, down through the western dark, and back up into the east again. Memory pulls differently depending on the direction you approach it from. I have been thinking, in these later years, about where I began. Not where the arc begins, not the eastern shore where my horses lift from the edge of Oceanus into the dark above. Before that, before the chariot, before the first crossing. My father is Hyperion. My mother is Theia. These are facts I have carried so long they have worn smooth, like river stones held in the hand season after season. Hyperion, the one who walks high above. Theia, whose name means simply divine. 2 Titans whose children were given the sky to manage, each in our turn, each in our portion. I came into the world knowing light. That is perhaps the strangest thing to explain to anyone who did not begin as I did. Most beings learn light gradually. They open their eyes into it. They grow accustomed to it over years, building slowly their understanding of what brightness is and what it asks of them. For me, it was already present. A birthright, an inheritance, a given condition. My first memory is not of darkness giving way to light. My first memory is simply light. Theia shaped it with me, those early times. She had a way of gathering radiance the way a cupped hand gathers water. Her palms would fill with it, and she would show me how it moved, how it pooled in low places and climbed the sides of things, how it changed when it touched stone versus when it touched water. Stone holds it for a moment. Water moves it immediately, breaks it into pieces that scatter and reform. She said this many times in different ways, as if she wanted me to understand not just the rule but the feeling underneath the rule. Light and water share an impatience, she said. Neither can stay still for long. I understood her hands before I understood her words. I watched what she did with her palms, the slight tilt that would send the gathered brightness rolling in one direction or another, and I copied it. My small hands. The light was clumsy in them at first. Too much in one direction, too little in another, uneven. She did not correct me sharply. She simply showed me again, patient, and waited while I found the angle. My father watched from further away. Hyperion moved through those early memories like a weather system rather than a person, large, warm, present in the way a constant light is present rather than the way a face is present. He had his own great work. The sun was already his to tend, or rather, Helios was already his, and his attention went much of the time toward that brightness, that enormous. Necessary fire his son would one day take fully in hand, but there was a morning, and I do not know which morning it was. I cannot place it on any sequence of days, because memory does not give me that. There was a morning when Hyperion came to me alone, without Theia nearby, and he set something on my brow, a crescent of pale metal, curved like the moon before it reaches fullness, cool against my forehead. Not heavy, though I expected weight. Lighter than I imagined, and that surprised me. I had thought a crown would feel like a burden placed. This felt like a recognition. He did not make a ceremony of it. He set it there and stepped back and looked at me the way a craftsman looks at finished work. Not proud exactly, satisfied. A different thing. You are the lamp of the night, he said. Or, that is the closest I can bring it into words now. His language was older than the words I learned later. He spoke in that Titan way that is half meaning and half sensation, where the word and the feeling it describes arrive simultaneously, inseparably. What he said was that the night sky had been waiting for me, that the stars alone were not enough, that there was a particular dark hour, the middle one, after Eos's last light had fully faded and before she began to return, when the world needed something softer than stars. I was that something. Standing in the hall of my parents' palace, with the crescent cool on my brow and my father's eyes on me, I understood for the first time that my work was not simply movement, not simply driving a chariot from east to west each night. The work was coverage, presence, attending to the hours that otherwise go unwitnessed. The dead hours, some call them, the middle of the night, the time when even the owls grow still. Those hours were mine. I remember Helios was there at some point. He had already begun his training on the golden chariot, and he came in smelling of warm metal and something that might have been scorched grass. Tracking the evidence of his own practice across the marble floor, he looked at my crescent crown and said something I no longer remember clearly, something that was teasing and also genuinely impressed. The way of a sibling who wants to diminish what they cannot help admiring. I think I did not respond. I was still feeling the weight of what my father had placed on me, or the absence of weight, which was its own kind of message. Eos was younger then, or perhaps she was already busy with her own preparation. She appears in this memory only in the way that a presence you know is nearby appears. A sound at the other end of the hall, a flash of rose gold at the threshold. She was always moving, even then. Even as a child she was in motion, tilting toward the next thing, drawn forward by some inner urgency I have never fully shared. I was the opposite of Eos in this way. My nature was to settle rather than to rush, to spread slowly, to find the still places and remain in them. Theia came back before the memory ends. She stood beside me and looked at the crescent on my brow and said nothing for a long time. Then she touched it with one finger, just briefly, the lightest possible contact, as if confirming something she had already known. She told me the moon changes shape without changing. She said this carefully, that the phases mortals would watch from the world below were not changes in what I was, only changes in how much of me was visible. The light is constant, she said. What shifts is only the angle, only what the darkness shows or hides. I was very young. I did not know then what mortals I would watch from above, or what hillsides I would find myself returning to in thought. I did not know Carrier. I did not know the name Latmos. I did not know what it would feel like to look down from the summit of the arc at a figure lying still in pale grass on a slope above the sea. The crescent crown was cool on my brow. The hall was quiet. Outside, the sky was waiting in its enormous patience. And somewhere in the forward dark of what had not yet happened, a hillside I would not yet visit for a very long time held its shape above a coastline I had not yet seen. What I understood only later, after I had crossed the sky many hundreds of times, was that the three of us were never meant to share the same piece of heaven at once. This seems obvious now. It is the kind of obvious that takes a long time to arrive at. The sky is large, yes, but it is a single road, and three chariots cannot drive the same road in the same direction at the same hour without consequence. Hyperion had arranged us like a clock, though that word belongs to a later age and does not quite fit. He had arranged us like a breath, Eos first opening, then Helios rising through what she had opened, then evening coming, and Helios descending, and myself rising from the east as he sank west, then night, which was mine, then the slow return of Eos at the far edge of my descent. Inhale, sustain. Exhale, begin again. That was the order of us. I remember understanding this not as a lesson, but as a sensation. The same way you understand the shape of a room when you have stood in it long enough. The pattern entered me. I stopped thinking about it and simply knew it. Eos goes first. She has always gone first. Her chariot is rose-tinted, her horse is the colour of a sky that cannot quite decide between pink and gold. She opens the gates on the eastern edge of the world, those great bronze doors that stand above the waters of Oceanus, and she drives out ahead of Helios to announce him. She scatters her light forward across the sky, the way someone might scatter petals before a procession, soft, abundant, forward-moving. Then Helios comes. His chariot blazes. It is not soft. It is necessary and enormous, the way a furnace is necessary and enormous, and when he rides it, the sky becomes a different thing entirely. His horses are fire-coloured. Their breath is actual heat. Watching them from a distance, even as a young goddess, I could feel the warmth pressing against my face like an open hand. Helios is not harsh. He is simply large. He fills whatever space he occupies completely. When he is in the sky, there is no room for anything else, and that is where I fit. In the space he vacates. I have thought about this often. My work begins in the exact moment when his ends. There is a threshold, a thin red seam along the western horizon, where the last of his light and the first of my light are briefly in the same place. Briefly, then he has gone beneath, and the sky belongs to me. I was taught that this crossing point had a name in the old Titan language, a word that meant something like the hinge of the day, the place where the turning happens. I do not have the word in any language I still use. It lived in that older speech, the one Hyperion spoke, where sound and meaning are the same substance. I remember the shape of it, the way it sat in the mouth. But I cannot bring it forward into words. What I can say is that the hinge of the day was mine to keep. Not Helios's, not Eos's. Mine. Then there is Oceanus. This is what I want to turn toward now, because it is part of what makes the sky's order real rather than merely described. Oceanus is the river that circles the world. Not a river the way mortals know rivers, narrow and purposeful, moving toward a sea. Oceanus is the outer rim, the boundary, the place where the known world ends and something older begins. It does not move toward anything. It simply encircles. Each of us crosses it. Eos rises out of it each morning from a palace on its far bank beyond the eastern edge of the earth. Helios descends into it each evening on the west, and his horses, those enormous fire-coloured animals, are cooled in its waters while he rides in a great golden cup along the current. Carrying himself from west back east again beneath the world, ready to begin once more, I cross it too. There is a moment each night, near the beginning of my crossing, when I am above those outer waters. When I look down and see not the familiar landscape of Greece, not the islands and the mountains and the dark lines of the roads, but only that great encircling river below me and beyond it. The edge of the world, and beyond the edge, nothing. The nothing does not frighten me. I have stood above it enough times now that I hold it the way one holds a known thing. It is simply the rim, the place where the circle closes. Helios crosses under it, hidden. Eos waits on its far bank until her hour. I alone ride above it visibly, my light falling down into those outer waters. The reflection of my chariot travelling beneath me on the current. Sometimes I look for that reflection and think about what it means. A moon above the river and a moon below it, both moving in the same direction. One of them is me. One of them is only light falling on water. I have never been certain which is which. I think Theia would have something precise to say about that, if I had thought to ask her at the right moment. She understood the behaviour of light on water far better than I did when I was young. She would have explained it without mystifying it. She had that way. She could take a thing that felt enormous and show you its actual dimensions, which were always manageable, but that question never found its moment. There are many things I did not think to ask when the asking was still easy. What I did learn in those first nights above Oceanus was that the sky had a texture I had not expected. Up close, from inside it, the sky is not the smooth dark bowl it appears to be from below. It breathes. It shifts. The air at high altitude moves in long, slow patterns, almost like water, and my chariot rides those patterns the way a boat rides a current. Not forced through, carried. My horses are white. I want to say that simply, without building toward it. Two white horses, pale as the light they carry me through, they do not resist. They move the way the night itself moves, which is not fast, but is also never quite still. Helios's horses are fire. My horses are something else, cloud pale, star cool. When I rest my hand on a flank during the crossing, I feel steadiness, not the burning readiness of his animals, the compressed heat and urgency. My horses carry patience in their stride. This, I think, is what Hyperion intended when he arranged the three of us in that particular order. Not just a division of the day, a division of qualities. Urgency at the centre, when the world must be lit and warmed and dried and driven forward. Softness at the edges, in the opening and in the covering over. Eos and I are both soft in this way, though different in our softness. Hers moves toward. Mine settles. The sky needs all of it. Rush and stillness both. The gold chariot and the silver one. Somewhere beneath my crossing, every night, the world is receiving what I carry. the fields and the roads and the harbours and the hillsides. I pass over all of them without preference. I do not choose which slope to illuminate and which to pass in relative darkness. I only drive the arc. Though there is one hillside I remember pausing above longer than the others. Not tonight. That comes later in the telling. For now there is only the arc, the white horses, the outer river below, circling everything that has a name, and the nameless dark beyond it, and above all of it, my light falling where it falls, covering the hours that no one else attends. That hillside is Mount Latmos. I will say it plainly now, because the story requires it. Caria to the east and south. A region of low mountains and goat paths, of fig trees and limestone, of shepherds who know the stars because they sleep under them. Mount Latmos rises from that landscape without drama, not tall by divine measure, not famous for anything except the thing that happened there, the thing that I made happen there by stopping. I had passed over it before, many times without pausing. Then one night I saw him. He was lying on the slope near a cluster of dark cedar trees. A shepherd, by the look of what was around him, a crook laid beside his hand. A rough cloak folded under his head, the faint white shapes of his flock dispersed across the hillside below him like scattered salt, asleep. Deeply, genuinely asleep, the way mortals sleep when they have spent the day walking and the body simply takes what it needs. His face was turned upward. I do not know what made me slow the horses. They felt it too, perhaps, that small involuntary shift in my attention. They eased their pace without being asked. The silver chariot hung a moment over that slope, and I looked down at a mortal face receiving my light, and I felt something that had no name yet. It was not desire at first, or not only that. It was more like recognition. The way you see something and understand immediately that you will not be able to forget it. The way a shape resolves out of fog, and once you have seen it clearly, the fog is just the fog again, not hiding anything. His name I learned later. Endymion, but that first night I did not know his name. I only knew the quality of his stillness. He did not toss or murmur or pull his cloak tighter the way cold sleepers do. He simply lay there in full receipt of my light, his face open to it, and I had the strange impression that he was accepting it deliberately, the way a cupped hand accepts water. He could not have been. He was asleep. I told myself that as I drove on, but I came back the next night, and the next. For several nights I only watched. I kept the horses at their pace, and let the ark carry me over Latmos, but I tilted my chariot a little, angled my light toward that particular slope. It was a small adjustment. The rest of the world received what it needed. Only a little more fell there than was strictly required. He was there each time, sleeping in the same general place, near the same cluster of cedars. His flock shifted slightly, grazing lower or higher depending on the night. He shifted too, sometimes facing left, sometimes on his back. But always there, always asleep before the deep hours of my crossing. On the seventh night I descended. This is not something I had done before, except in specific ritual contexts. Passages of light during eclipses, moments when the sky required adjustments I could not manage from full altitude. Descent is not forbidden to me. It simply is not what I do, ordinarily. My work is the ark. The crossing. I am not a goddess of the earth, in the way Demeter is, or even in the way Artemis moves through it. But on the seventh night I brought the horses down. I left them on the slope below him, in a flat stretch of grass between two limestone outcroppings. They stood together quietly, barely moving, their white flanks pale against the dark hillside. Not restless, patient as they are. I walked up to where he lay. The ground was warm still from the day's sun, releasing its stored heat slowly into the night air. The cedars around me held their resinous smell, dry and clean. Somewhere on the hillside below, one of his sheep made a small sound and then was quiet. I stood over him for a long time before I sat down. His face. Close, was younger than I had understood from above. He was not a boy, but not far past the beginning of a man either. His hands were rough, the skin at his knuckles cracked from cold and work. His hair was dark. His breathing was the slowest, most regular thing I had encountered in a long time, perhaps ever slower even than the rhythm of my horses. I sat cross-legged beside him on the slope and watched him breathe. I did not touch him that first night. I only sat near him, close enough to feel the warmth that his body gave off, close enough that my light fell on him from directly above rather than from the sky's distance. He must have been the most thoroughly illuminated shepherd in Caria, his flock too by proxy. He did not wake. I had not expected him to. But some part of me had almost hoped for it. The hope was foolish, and I set it aside. He was mortal, and it was deep night, and he had been awake since before dawn. He was not going to open his eyes and find me beside him. The world is not arranged for that kind of meeting. Still, I stayed until the hours pressed me back toward my ark. Before I left, I did touch his face. Only once. The back of 2 fingers set lightly against his cheekbone for a moment, the way you might touch something you are not sure is real. He was real, warm. He breathed in slightly and turned toward my hand without waking, the way sleeping people sometimes turn toward warmth. I pulled my fingers back. I walked down the slope to my horses. They had not moved. I climbed back into the silver chariot and rose again into the sky and completed my crossing, for the rest of that night, across all the mountains and islands and dark harbours of the world below. I drove without seeing any of it. His cheekbone was all I had. The warmth of him, the way he had turned unconsciously toward the light. I came back the following night, and the night after that. Each time I descended, I sat a little closer. Each time I stayed a little longer. He never woke. He never knew, in any waking sense, that a goddess had taken to spending her deepest hours beside him on the slope of Latmos, while his sheep grazed below and the stars made their slow turn overhead. But he always turned toward me. Every night. Even before I was close enough to touch him, even when I was only sitting 2 arm lengths away, something in him oriented toward the light. His sleeping face, tipping slightly upward, his hands loosening from whatever they had been holding in his dreams. I began to learn the particular language of his sleep, the deeper hours when he barely breathed, the lighter ones near dawn when his eyes moved behind their lids and his lips shaped words he was not saying aloud. I never heard those words. I was not there long enough. Dawn would press me from the slope, and I would leave him at the edge of his dreaming, not knowing what he was about to say. That not knowing became its own small ache, not enormous, not unbearable, just present. A steady low feeling, like the way the sky breathes at high altitude, always moving, never entirely still. The ache did not stay small. This is something I remember clearly, though the specific nights blur together now into one long accumulated feeling. There was a point, somewhere in those weeks on Latmos, when I stopped being able to complete my crossing without carrying him with me, not literally. He slept on his hillside, his flock grazed. His crook lay beside his open hand. But my attention, which had always moved ahead of my chariot, scanning the dark waters and the mountain ridges and the distant fires of coastal cities, began to trail backward, toward the slope I had just left, toward the hollow in the grass, where his cloak was folded under his head. I noticed this most clearly one night over the Aegean. The sea below me was flat and dark, scattered with the lights of fishing boats making their slow work. The water caught my reflection in broken pieces, white fragments spreading and rocking with each small wave. I had crossed this sea 10,000 times. I know its islands. I know where the currents run and where the shoals break the surface at low tide. That night I could not have told you which island was below me. I was thinking about the way his hands had looked an hour earlier, the crack along his right knuckle. the calluses at the base of his fingers, the way his palm had been slightly open, as though he were waiting for something to be placed in it. My horses felt my distraction. They are patient animals, but they are also sensitive in the way that creatures of divine origin often are. The one on the left, the older of the two, had a way of turning her head slightly when she felt my grip loosen on the reins. A check. A small inquiry. That night she turned twice before I brought myself back to the ark. This is what I mean when I say my crossing changed. The work was the same. The ark was the same, rising from the east, traversing the sky, descending in the west, the ocean at the far edge, the palace of my father's house waiting at the end of each completed night. None of that altered, but the quality of my attention had shifted. The sky above me, which I had always found sufficient, now felt thin. Something about the world below had become insistent in a way it had never been before. I thought about this as I drove. I had time to think. The crossing is long, and I have made it long enough to have exhausted most contemplations many times over. What I arrived at was this: I had always looked at the world below, always noted it, the sailors who blessed my light, the farmers who planted by my phases, the women who timed their rituals to my waxing and waning. I had seen all of it for as long as I could remember, with the mild goodwill of someone watching people she is responsible for but not close to. Endymion had made a gap in that, not because he was remarkable in the way heroes are remarkable. He had no great deeds to his name. He was not gifted with prophecy or favoured by any god I knew of. He herded sheep on a carrion hillside. He slept soundly. These are not the qualities that usually draw divine attention, but there was something in the specificity of him. The particular crack of his knuckle, the particular rhythm of his breathing, which I could now have picked out from any field of sleeping mortals. The way his face went entirely smooth in deep sleep, all the small tensions of waking life released, so that he looked briefly like someone who had not yet lived a hard day. Mortals look like that sometimes, at their deepest, returned to something simpler. I had sat close enough on some of those later nights to see the pulse at his throat, steady and unhurried, his body doing its quiet work without him. I found this affecting in a way I had not anticipated. Something about the faithfulness of it, his heart continuing, his lungs continuing, all of it running on without his knowledge or effort, the body maintaining itself through the dark hours while the mind went somewhere else entirely. I wondered where he went in sleep, whether he knew he was dreaming, whether whatever he was dreaming had anything of light in it. On those nights I stayed long. I would finish the descent already thinking about the ride back, the length of the remaining arc. The hours before Eos would begin her work in the east, her rose-coloured preparations that I could see building at the horizon. Soft and preliminary, long before any mortal would notice the change. Eos is efficient. She gives no more warning than necessary. I had perhaps an hour between the first faint shift in the eastern sky and the moment when my continued presence on the slope would become untenable. I never quite used the whole hour. There was always a point, maybe 20 minutes before I truly needed to leave, when I would stand up, brush the dry earth from my hands, look at him one more time, his face still tilted upward, still receiving the light I gave without knowing he was receiving it. Standing above him in those last minutes, I was always aware of how much I could not give him, not wakefulness, not knowing, not the simple ordinary exchange of two people who have sat together through a night and can speak of it afterward. What I could give was what I gave, light from directly above rather than from distance. An hour of company he was not conscious of, the knowledge, mine alone and never his, that he had been watched over closely. On the walk down to my horses, I would pass the spot where his flock clustered at the lower end of the slope. They did not startle at me. Animals rarely do with a steady light. They lifted their heads, chewed, looked at me with their flat rectangular pupils, and returned to their grass. His sheep knew me. This felt significant in the small accounting of what had developed between his hillside and my ark. They did not run. They had stopped even turning fully toward me, the way they had on the first few nights. I had simply become part of the regular landscape at their dark hours, a light that came, stayed a while, and went. The horses, when I reached them, were always exactly where I had left them, between the limestone outcroppings on the flat section of grass. The older one would lift her head. The younger one would shift slightly, her white shoulder catching my approach. I would take the reins, climb up, rise, and behind me, above, on the cedar-smelling slope, he would still be sleeping. His face turned toward where I had been. There was a night when I did not reach Mount Latmos. I remember it the way I remember things that interrupted the pattern I had not fully admitted was a pattern. With a slight disorientation, the way you notice the absence of a sound only after it stops. I was perhaps 2/3 across the arc. The Aegean was below me, flat and black, my reflection broken into long white pieces by the low swells. The fishing boats were out. I could see their small fires, their separate darkness gathered around each light. I was already calculating the descent, the angle to bring the horses down toward Carrier. The remaining hours before Eos would begin her rose preparations in the east. Then I noticed the tree line. Not a tree line I recognized. There is a stretch of coast west of Latmos where the hills run down close to the water, heavily wooded, and in that darkness the pines were thick enough that no light reached through them. I had never had reason to pay attention to it. It was simply a dark section of a dark coastline, and my route passed over it without event. But that night there was movement in it, a figure at the edge where the trees thinned. White and large. Something about the shape of it was familiar in the wrong way. I brought the horses lower without thinking. This was, I recognized afterward, already a mistake. The ark has a correct height. There are reasons for the height. But the figure had the colouring of one of Endymion's sheep strayed far from the slope, and something in me pulled toward that small concern before I had properly assessed it. The figure did not move like a sheep. By the time I understood this, I was already close enough to the tree line to see what it was. A man wrapped in white fleece. The fleece was pulled around his shoulders and over part of his face, and in the dark, from the height of the ark, it had read as animal. But the legs beneath it were a man's legs. The hands, where they held the fleece closed at the throat, were a man's hands. Broad across the knuckles, unhurried. He looked up at me. His eyes caught my light from below, and they were not a man's eyes. I knew him. Pan, god of the wild, of herd animals, of the rough places where paths become uncertain, son of Hermes. More ancient in some ways than his genealogy suggests, carrying in him something of the older wilderness, before gods organized it into domains. He smiled. There was nothing threatening in it precisely. That is what I want to set down correctly. He was not aggressive. He did not lunge or shout. He simply stood at the edge of the tree line in a shepherd's fleece, looking up at me with a god's eyes, and smiled the way someone smiles when they have been waiting and are pleased the waiting is over. I held the horses. They were uncertain of him. The older one pulled slightly left, away from the trees. The younger one stood still, but her ears were forward in the manner that means alertness rather than calm. Pan said something. The distance and the wind took most of it, but the tone was easy, conversational. The tone of someone who does not expect to be refused. I should have risen. Put the ark back under me, continued east. Instead, I descended another degree, and then another, until I was low enough that his words reached me without the wind pulling them apart. He was speaking of the fleece, how he had come upon a flock earlier that evening, wandering without a shepherd, How the fleece had been necessary for warmth, as he told it, though Pan does not feel cold the way mortals do, and he did not bother to make the explanation convincing. He had the ease of someone who is not attempting to persuade so much as to extend an encounter. He asked me to come down into the trees. He said there was something he wanted to show me, something that only appeared in that wood on certain nights, a plant, a light, a thing with the quality of wonder about it. I am setting this down plainly because I have not allowed myself to think about it plainly in a long time. I knew it was not what he said it was. No plant required my physical presence on the ground to be observed. I had been watching the world from close range for longer than most of Pan's woods had been growing. He knew I knew this. What he was offering was not information. It was an interruption. He had watched me for some number of nights descending toward Latmos. I cannot know how many. Pan moves through the wild places without announcing himself, and Latmos has wild places. He had seen what I was doing on that hillside, or guessed at enough of it to understand there was something there to be tested, and he had dressed himself in shepherd's fleece, white, to catch my light, to look from the height of the ark like one of Endymion's strayed sheep. The precision of it, that is what stays with me. He had thought about how I would see him from above. He had chosen the fleece deliberately. My horses were still uncertain. The older one had stopped pulling left, but her head was low, ears angled toward the dark between the trees. I looked at Pan. He stood comfortably in the fleece, holding it closed at one shoulder, and his expression had shifted to something more direct. He was watching my face. He did not look away when I met his eyes. There was a kind of acknowledgment in it. He was not pretending the encounter was what he had said it was. He knew I understood him, and he was not bothering with the pretense any further, just the directness of his attention. A god looking at another god with complete frankness. Here is what this is. Will you come down? I turned the horses east. It was not dramatic. There was no speech. My hands closed on the reins, and the horses understood immediately. They lifted gratefully, the older one's head coming up as if released from something. The ark reasserted itself beneath me, the correct altitude, the familiar angle, the long remaining curve toward the western sea. I did not look back at the tree line. For a time I watched only the horizon. The Aegean arranged itself below me again, the fishing boats, the broken reflection. Ahead, the dark western sky where I was headed. Behind, already far enough to be reduced, the eastern edge where Eos would eventually make her start. I thought about Endymion. I was going to be late reaching him. The detour had cost perhaps half an hour. The slope would be the same, his face tilted toward the sky. The flock settled at the lower end, the dry earth and the smell of cedar. I thought about the fleece, the deliberateness of it. Pan had understood that the way to bring me down from my ark was to appear as something that already had my attention, a white shape on a dark hillside. Something that belonged to that shepherd's world. He had not been entirely wrong about what I was watching for. That is the part that stayed with me through the rest of the crossing. Not that he had tried. Not that I had gone lower than I should have, but that the shape he had chosen, white and low against dark ground, was close enough to what I was descending toward that I had followed it without thinking. The older horse shook her head once, a mild, restless gesture. The ark held. The night continued west. I was later than usual to Latmos that night. The remaining time on the slope was shorter than I preferred. I stood above him for only a few minutes before the east began to lighten. His face was turned upward. His breathing was what it was, the crook beside his open hand. I did not stay the 20 minutes. I left earlier. The horses were already waiting. On the way back up, I noted that the western tree line was empty and still. The night after that one passed without incident. The ark held at the correct height. Both horses moved steadily. The western tree line was below and behind me before I had fully committed to watching it, and then it was gone, reduced to a dark smudge at the edge of the Aegean. I reached Latmos at the usual time. He was there. The flock was settled. The crook was where it always was, resting against his open palm as if he had simply set it down for a moment and meant to pick it up again. I stayed the full time. But I have been thinking about what it means to love something that cannot respond to being loved, not the grief of it. I have moved past grief about this, or I think I have. What I mean is something more particular. The mechanics of it. What actually happens when one person holds attention toward another who is entirely still? I have had time to consider this, more time than most. When I first came to Latmos, I told myself the stillness was temporary, that I was watching over him in the way one watches over something fragile. A vessel that might tip, a flame that might gutter. There was a quality of guardianship in it, those early nights. I was present so that something would not be lost. That is not what it is now. Now I do not watch him to prevent something. I watch him because his face turned upward is a specific thing, not a universal one. The angle of his chin, the hollow beneath his left eye, a shadow that appears only when my light falls directly overhead, his breathing, which is slow and even, the breathing of someone who has nowhere to be and nothing pressing on him. He does not dream that I can see. His face carries nothing of anxiety or pursuit. He is simply there, held in that long stillness that began before most of the cities along the Aegean had their first stones laid. I have daughters. 50 of them, though that number is a formal accounting rather than something I experience as a count. I do not think of them as 50. I think of them as scattered light, portions of my attention that have taken form and moved out into the world in their own directions. When I watch my light spread across the sea on a clear night, fragmenting across the surface where small waves catch it and throw it back at angles, that is something close to how I understand them. Each one a counted piece, each one moving at her own rate. Endymion does not know them. He does not know me, not in the way that requires waking. And yet they exist, 50 daughters made from a love that only ever moved in one direction. I do not find this as strange as I once did. There is a certain precision to a love that travels only outward. Nothing comes back to complicate it, no word said in the wrong moment. No misunderstanding carried forward into the next night. He is always exactly what he is. And I am always arriving. I think about this when the arc is long and the sea is flat and there is nothing requiring my attention. Which is most of the crossing, if I am honest. The horses know the route. The light manages itself. There are hours in the middle portion of the arc where the world below is dark and quiet, and I am simply a lamp moving over water. Those hours have their own texture, different from the descent toward Caria, different from the climb out of the east. Just the middle passage, the flat Aegean. The occasional fire on a fishing boat. I have thought on those crossings about what Pan understood and what he did not. He understood the shape I was watching for, white against dark ground. Something low on a hillside belonging to a shepherd's world. He constructed the image carefully and placed it where I would see it from above. What he did not understand, or did not care to understand, was that the shape was not the point. The shape was a direction. What I was moving toward was not a white form on a dark slope. It was the specific weight of that particular hillside. The cedar smell. The quality of silence that belongs to Latmos and not to anywhere else I cross. He had the outline correct. He did not have the contents. I do not say this to dismiss what he did. There was precision in it, real precision, the kind that requires genuine observation over time. He had watched me. He had drawn conclusions. He had acted on them with care. But a map of a place is not the place. The younger horse has settled into her work over these recent nights. She is less still than she was. There is a rhythm to her now, a comfortable extension and return in her stride, the motion of something that has accepted its task. The older one moves as she always has, steady, slightly cautious, ears attentive to anything below the arc that shifts or calls. I find them easier to read than most things. Endymion, I cannot read. That is perhaps the most honest way to say it. After all this time, with the number of nights I have stood above him and let my light fall across his face, I do not know what he is, not fully. He is a form. He is a quality of stillness. He is the thing on Latmos that the arc bends toward. What he would be if he woke is a question I set down a long time ago. Not because the answer frightened me, because the question had started to interfere with the actual experience of being there, above him. In the few hours between my arrival and the first grey lightning in the east. Some questions are less useful than others. The 50 daughters move through the world. I watch them sometimes, briefly, when my arc takes me over the places where they have settled. They do not look up the way mortals do. They know where I am without checking. That recognition, wordless and directional, is the closest I have to being known by something that came from me. It is enough. Not dramatically enough, not in the way of completion, just enough to continue. The hillside at Latmos is dry. The cedar smell rises even on still nights, something in the bark or the earth beneath, a slow exhale from the ground itself. The flock settles at the lower end of the slope and does not move much. Small sounds from them sometimes. Not distress, just the ordinary sounds of animals at rest. He is above them, further up the slope, where the ground flattens briefly before rising again toward the ridge. His face is the thing I see first when I come over the eastern hills. That angle, that particular tilt of chin toward sky, consistent across every night I have come here, the same degree of upward reach, as if he arranged himself once. Carefully, and then the sleep took hold and held him there. I have wondered sometimes whether he chose the angle or whether it found him. Whether some part of him, before the long sleep settled in, tilted toward the place my light would come from, there is no way to know. The arc continues past Latmos. There is still a long western curve remaining after I leave him, hours of crossing before I reach the ocean at the edge and hand the sky back to darkness. But that is the part of the night I am least present for. The part I am most present for is the brief time on the hillside. The crook beside his hand, the cedar, his face. I come back each night. That is the full account of it. Whatever it is, I return to it. The horses know the way. The arc holds. The east eventually turns, and I leave before Eos can see me still standing there. The western tree line last night was quiet. No white shapes, no voices carried up from the dark between the pines. Only the arc, only the crossing. Only Latmos waiting, the same as it has been, a specific wait on a specific hillside, his open hand resting against the crook's worn handle. There was a night, earlier than most of what I carry with me, when I left the ark, not because of Pan. Not because something pulled me off course from outside. I left deliberately and alone, turning the horses toward Olympus rather than completing the westward descent. The older horse hesitated at the change in direction. She felt the deviation in the reins before I fully committed to it. Her ear turned back toward me. I did not explain. I held the course northward, and after a moment she accepted it, settling into the new angle with the resigned patience of something that has seen its driver make difficult choices before. The younger horse did not hesitate at all. She was still new enough then that every direction felt like a direction. Olympus at night is not the Olympus that other stories describe. There is no thunder waiting on the steps, no lightning stored in visible arrangement. It is simply very high. The air is thin and cold and carries no particular smell. Below it, everything I cross each night looks small and even. The Aegean is a dark field. The islands are scattered marks. Latmos from that altitude is nothing distinct at all, just a fold in the Carrion coastline, indistinguishable from the other folds. That perspective disturbed me, not because Latmos felt small from above, because I felt nothing different about it from that height. The pull was the same, even from the coldest point of the sky, with Olympus visible in the northwest and the whole of the world laid flat below. My attention went to that particular fold in the coast. That was the night I understood the petition could not wait. Zeus was not difficult to find. He does not hide himself, even at the late hours when his court is quieted and the other gods have retired to their own concerns. He was seated in a part of Olympus that faced east, watching the turn of the sky with an expression I recognized as professional attention. The same look Helios has when the weather over the western sea does not resolve cleanly at dusk, competence considering a variable. He knew I was there before I said anything. He did not greet me with ceremony. He said simply, "You have come about the shepherd," and his voice was not unkind. I had prepared words. I had arranged them during the long crossing from Latmos to Olympus, ordered them, rehearsed the sequence in which they would be most precise. None of that preparation mattered. What came out was simpler than preparation allows. He is going to age, I said. He is going to change. And when he does, the thing on the hillside will not be the thing on the hillside. Zeus was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone forming a refusal, the quiet of someone measuring a request against the full weight of what granting it will mean. He asked what I was asking for. I said, sleep, permanent sleep, not death, the continuation of the form, the face at that angle, the crook in his hand, the specific quality of that stillness held without degradation, held without the interruption that aging brings, immortality, but inward, the kind that does not require waking. I heard myself say it. The words, once spoken, became the fixed shape of something I had been moving toward without fully seeing it, a direction made explicit. The request was irreversible in the instant of its completion, not because Zeus granted it immediately, though he did, but because I had spoken the shape of what I wanted, and spoken things are different from felt things, they hold differently. They cannot be quietly revised in the middle passage over the Aegean. Zeus looked at me for a long time, not appraisingly, with something more careful than appraisal. He said, "You understand what you are asking, not a question." A confirmation. I said yes. He said, "The sleep will be complete. He will not know you are there." I said, "He does not know I am there now." Another silence. Then Zeus gave his assent. The manner was formal but without weight. A small gesture of one hand, the slight forward movement of his head, the kind of gesture that closes a matter without requiring further discussion. The horses were waiting where I had left them, below the eastern shoulder of Olympus. The older one's ears came up when she heard my step on the stone. The younger one was watching something on the ground, some small movement in the rock, and looked up only when the older one did. The arc resumed. East to west, the same curvature it always holds, the same distance from the surface of things. Latmos came into view as I descended toward Carrier. First the ridge, then the flatter ground below the ridge, then the slope and the flock at the lower end, and him above them, face tilted at the familiar angle. The sleep was already complete when I arrived that night. Zeus works without delay. What had been a shepherd's ordinary unconsciousness, the kind that ends at dawn, had been replaced with the other kind, the permanent kind, the kind with no edges. His breathing was the same, his face was the same. The crook lay against his hand in the same position. Nothing visible had changed. What had changed was something I could only describe by the absence of a certain tension. Before, crossing toward Latmos on any given night, there had been a small, persistent awareness that this might be one of the last nights before illness, before age, before the ordinary deterioration of mortal things. That awareness had been so constant I had stopped noticing it. The way a sound heard every night stops registering until it stops. It stopped that night. What remained was the hillside, the cedar exhalation from the ground, the flat shelf of earth before the ridge. His face, that specific upward tilt, the hollow beneath his left eye filling with my light as I came to the angle directly overhead. His open hand against the worn handle, not holding it, resting beside it. I stayed until the east began to grey. Then I took the horses back to the Ark and continued westward. The decision, considered plainly, was this. I chose continuation over possibility. The form preserved against the unknown of what change would have brought. Some would call it a narrowing. It was also a kind of fidelity to what was real rather than what might have been different. The 50 daughters came later, each one a counted breath of that particular love. Held in the world as light holds in still water, present without requiring acknowledgment. The Ark descends each night past Latmos, past the cedar slope, past the flock settled at the low end, past the ridge, past the flat shelf of ground, past the crook and the worn handle and the face at its fixed angle. The thing I asked Zeus for, I still find it there, the 50 daughters. I have thought about them differently at different points in the long arc of years. Early on, I understood them as consequence, the ordinary result of love expressed in the way that love, divine or mortal, tends to express itself. Later, I understood them as record, evidence that something had occurred, that the crossing to Latmos had happened not once but 50 times in a particular way, each time leaving behind a kind of remainder. Now, descending past the Carrion coastline on a night with no particular weather, I think of them as light does. Not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically. Light disperses. It leaves the source and moves outward. It does not ask whether the surfaces it reaches are prepared to receive it. It falls on stone and on water and on closed eyelids without preference. What it touches, it illuminates briefly, then it continues past. The 50 daughters are like that, each one a direction my light took. Each one a particular angle of departure, a specific vector outward from the hillside on Latmos, from the cedar slope, from the space between us that was never less than absolute. I watch them sometimes from the Ark, not by looking down, though I could do that, by noticing where the light thins and reforms, where a particular clarity moves across the terrain below in a way that is not entirely my own doing. They carry fragments of my luminescence in them, distributed, dispersed, moving through the world below in paths I did not prescribe. There is one who walks at night along cliff edges, looking outward at the sea. I recognize the posture, the slight upward tilt of the face, the open quality of the hands. She does not know she carries it. She is simply herself. But the angle of her attention is a thing I know. There is another who stands at the edges of rivers at dusk, watching the current. She does not watch for anything in particular. She watches because the watching itself is the point. That disposition came through me, I think. Or through him. Or through the particular combination of his stillness and my motion, something that resolves in the character of a daughter as a capacity for sustained attention without object. 50 of them, each distinct, each carrying some particular refraction of what I carry, what he carries in his sealed and permanent way. The number is not incidental. The Greeks who counted seasons understood it as the count of lunar months within the 4-year cycle they used to organize their festivals and games. 50 months. 50 daughters. The correspondence was not coincidence. It was the way meaning organizes itself around pattern, around the fact that time and love, measured carefully, tend to arrive at the same numbers. I have thought about that alignment. The 50 months of the Olympiad, the 50 daughters born from what I felt on that hillside, as if my love, mapped against the sky's own accounting, produces the same sum. As if the sky knew, long before I did, how many times I would descend toward Latmos with that particular quality of attention in my chest. The older horse does not require guidance past Latmos any more. Her path curves toward it naturally, the way water finds a channel it has taken before. On nights when my attention is elsewhere, occupied with the crossing's technical demands, the thin, high cloud layers that diffuse my light and require compensation, she corrects toward the carrion ridge without being asked. She has learned what I want before I have finished wanting it. The younger horse still needs occasional direction, a slight pressure through the reins, a shift in the angle of approach. She will learn. She is learning. Each crossing deposits something in her, a small increment of understanding, the way repetition slowly aligns an animal's instinct with its rider's intention. In another generation of crossings, she will curve toward Latmos without prompting, the way the older one does. When I pass directly overhead, at the angle where the arc reaches its highest point above Latmos, there is a particular quality to how my light falls across the hillside, not brighter exactly, more direct. The shadows shift orientation. The cedar ground exhales something darker, more resinous, as if the heat of my overhead passage draws a different level of the scent upward, his face at that angle, the hollow beneath his left eye filling, that specific pool of silver contained by the curve of bone beneath the orbital ridge, held there for the duration of the overhead crossing, then releasing as I move past and the shadow realigns. The 50 daughters are that. Each one a pool formed by a particular geography, each one the result of my light finding a shaped space and filling it. They hold what they receive for their own duration, in their own configurations. Then I continue past, and what they hold becomes their own to carry. I do not manage their paths. That was never the arrangement. They took their particular shapes and moved into the world below my arc, and what they do with the light they carry is their business entirely. One walks cliff edges. One watches rivers. The others scatter across the territories of the world with their own preoccupations, their own angled faces, their own open hands. The 50 lunar months of the Olympiad are a measurement of time, a way of counting a cycle's completion. My daughters are a measurement of love, a way of counting what occurred between the hillside and the ark, between his stillness and my motion, between the request I made to Zeus and the permanent sleep that followed. 50, the same number, different counts of the same duration. This is what I mean when I say they are like light. Not that they are radiant, though some are, in the way mortals use the word, but that they do what light does. They depart from a source. They move outward. They reach surfaces they did not choose. They illuminate briefly the particular textures of whatever they fall upon, then continue past. None of them need to know I am watching to be seen by me. That condition, too, I recognize. The arc levels slightly after the Latmos overhead. The horses settle into the second portion of the crossing, the long descent toward the western sea. The older one's breathing shifts, slower, deeper. The work of the ascent complete, the body recalibrating for descent. I let the reins rest in my hands without pulling. The path is known. The horses know it. The arc holds us in its curve, the way a riverbed holds water, not by force, but by a shaped absence that the moving thing fills without resistance. Below me, the world turns its dark face upward, cities settled into quiet, harbours with their reflected columns of silver, the black interiors of mountains where no light penetrates and my daughters do not walk. Somewhere below, one of them is standing at the edge of something, looking outward. She does not know she is counted. She is the 31st month of the cycle, the one that falls in the middle of things, neither beginning nor completion, simply the sustained middle portion where endurance is the whole of what is asked. She stands there in her particular posture. face at the familiar angle, and holds in her, without knowing it, the specific quality of that hillside, of a love expressed through sustained proximity to something that does not wake, of a choice made in Olympus in the cold and the thin air, sealed with a small forward movement of a god's head, a counted breath held in the world, present without requiring acknowledgment. The western sea comes into view. The western sea opens wide beneath the chariot's descent. The water holds my light differently than the land does. Where a hillside or a cedar slope will catch and hold a pool of silver in its concave places, the sea disperses it. Each small movement of the surface breaks the reflection into fragments, and those fragments break again, multiplying outward until what began as a coherent column of light becomes something scattered and plural across the water's face. I have thought about this, the way certain surfaces receive and certain surfaces refuse. The sea does not refuse. It simply will not hold still long enough to contain. The horses feel the slope of the descent. The older one leans back slightly into the traces, redistributing her weight toward her haunches. The younger follows, a beat behind, still learning the muscular geometry of the downward arc. They breathe steadily. The chariot moves. Then something changes. Not gradually, not the way the arc shifts or the light conditions alter as clouds pass through. Something pulls. From below, from a point southeast of the Thessalian coast, a pull that has no direction in the conventional sense. It is not like wind. Wind moves across the body from outside. This is interior, a tug against the source of my light itself, as if the brightness I carry has been caught by something and is being drawn downward while I continue forward. I have felt this before. I know what it is before I can name it. The Thessalian women. Their fires on the hillsides, their words in the dark. The first time it happened, I did not understand what was occurring. I only knew that the arc faltered. The horses lurched, confused by a tension they could not source. The younger one then, different horses in an earlier age, had shied sideways, and the chariot had tilted. I had pulled back hard on the reins, not to correct the horses, but because there was nothing else to hold on to while the pull intensified. My light bending toward the earth like water tipped from a vessel, pouring downward at an angle that was not the arc's angle, not my angle. It had felt like dissolution. That is the closest word. Not pain, not fear exactly, more the sensation of a form losing its defined edges. The way a pool of silver in a hillside hollow might feel, if it had feeling, if the hollow beneath it suddenly tilted and the contained shape began to slide. I am the luminous one. My name derives from the brightness I carry, Thelas. Light. To have that light drawn from me by mortal fire and mortal words, to feel it bending toward the earth against my intention, is to feel the name itself being pulled apart. The horses feel it now. The older one breaks her rhythm. Her head comes up and her ears move forward. She does not know what she is responding to, only that something in the traces has become inconsistent. A tension that does not correspond to slope or wind or my hands. I take the reins more firmly. The pull comes in waves, not continuous. There is the initial drawing sensation, then a pause, then a stronger pull as the words below intensify, then another pause. I can feel the rhythm of their ritual in the way my light bends and releases and bends again. They are chanting in intervals. The fires on the Thessalian hills, small orange points from this altitude, are being fed in sequence. Mortals believe they can bring me down, that their words and their fires and their careful rituals can drag the moon from the sky and compel her to their purposes. Healing, some of them want, prophecy others. Some want the night prolonged because what they are doing in the dark requires darkness to continue, and my passage across the sky toward morning is inconvenient to them. What they are actually pulling is not me. I want to be precise about this, though there is no one here to receive the precision. What they pull is the dispersal of my light, The outer layer of brightness that extends beyond the chariot, beyond the horses, beyond my own form, the scatter of illumination that reaches the surfaces below. That part is genuinely moved by their ritual. It bends. It tilts toward the fires they have lit. I have seen my own reflection fragmented in their ceremonial bowls, pulled down into the dark water they hold upward. But I remain in the ark. The ark holds me. This is not comfort exactly, more a structural fact. The ark is not something I can leave, and nothing below can lift me out of it entirely. What the Thessalian women accomplish is a distortion, not a true drawing down. And yet, the distortion is its own kind of violation. My sovereignty over the crossing is not absolute in the way I had assumed in my first centuries. The ark holds me, yes, but the light I carry does not belong only to my will. It falls on all surfaces equally, without preference, without intending to illuminate this harbour or that hillside. That dispersal has always been its nature. The Thessalian women have understood something about dispersal that I did not initially consider. What moves freely in all directions can be redirected. Not controlled, not truly, but bent toward a particular intention. I pull against it, not with the reins which have nothing to grip. I pull the way a source pulls, by intensifying, by gathering the brightness inward rather than dispersing it. The glow tightens around the chariot. The Thessalian hills grow darker. Their fires become more visible against the surrounding dark because my light has withdrawn from the spaces between them. This is what I know how to do. Gather rather than scatter. Hold rather than pour. The horses steady. The older one's head lowers back to her travelling angle. The younger one's ears relax from their forward alertness. Below, the chanting continues, but the pull diminishes. Not because they have stopped, because there is less available at the outer edge to grip. I hold the gathering through several more of their intervals. The western sea receives less of my light than usual during this portion of the descent. The harbours that would show columns of silver are darker. Sailors below, navigating by my brightness, will have found the sky more difficult to read tonight in this stretch of the Thessalian coast. This is the cost of gathering. What I hold close I do not pour outward. At some point, when the distance between the chariot and the Thessalian hills has grown sufficient, I release the gathering. The light disperses outward again. The sea catches it and breaks it into its usual plural scatter. The older horse exhales deeply. A long breath, with effort in it. I feel the fading echo of the pull, a residual sensation, the way a sound continues briefly as an interior vibration after the noise itself has ceased. The dissolution is over. The edges of my form are clear again. The light moves outward without redirection. What remains is a kind of knowledge. Each time this happens, each time the Thessalian fires find the outer reach of my light and draw it downward, I understand more precisely the difference between dispersal as gift and dispersal as vulnerability. My light given freely to the sleeping cities and the dark sea is one thing. My light taken, bent against my ark's direction, reduced to a purpose not my own, is another count entirely. The 31st daughter stands somewhere below, holding in her particular posture. She does not know what her mother's light has just passed through. The sea carries my reflection forward, broken across its moving surface, uncountable and continuing. The sea carries my reflection forward, and I let it go. That is what I am learning to do with what cannot be held. Let it carry forward without me gripping it. The Thessalian residue. The tightness in the light that persists a little after I release the gathering, all of it moves forward into the night's remaining distance, dispersing at its own pace. I have been thinking about Zeus, not with dread, and not with the particular affection one saves for a parent or a sibling, something more complicated than either. a bond formed in a context I did not choose, with a god whose authority extends into territories I do not fully inhabit. My origin is Titanic. My parents are Hyperion and Theia, who are older than Olympus and quieter than anything that has come after. Zeus belongs to the generation that overcame them. And still, there is the fact of Pandia. She did not arrive the way the 50 arrived. The 50 came from Endymion, from those long nights on Latmos when I descended and sat beside the sleeping form and returned each evening to a love that did not wake but persisted in its stillness. The 50 are mortal touched. They carry something of the hillside in them, something of the earth's warmth. Pandia carries sky. I remember the first time I saw her clearly. Not the night of her birth, which happened below, away from the chariot, in a different kind of time, but the first night I watched her from above, from the ark, and recognized what she was. She stood in an open space, and the full moon's brightness fell on her without diminishing. Most things below absorb the light and reflect some portion of it back. Pandia held it. Her face held the full light without reduction. I watched my own brightness return to me from her, nearly unaltered. That is what her name means. All brightness. The fullness of illumination undiminished. Zeus said very little when we spoke. This is something I have noticed about him, and something that sets him apart from my understanding of his reputation. He is loud when he chooses loudness. Thunder is not a quiet instrument. But in stillness, in the particular stillness that falls after a decision has been made, and both parties know it, he is capable of a silence that feels considered rather than empty. We did not negotiate about Pandia the way I negotiated about Endymion. With Endymion, I came to Zeus with a request shaped and ready. I knew what I wanted. The words were prepared. The eternal sleep, the immortality, the preservation of the one I kept returning to. That conversation had architecture to it. A beginning, a middle, a resolution. Zeus listened with the expression of someone who finds mortal love entanglements mildly perplexing, but ultimately not his primary concern. He granted it. The conversation that produced Pandia had no such structure. It was less a negotiation than a recognition. Two forces that briefly shared a space, and from that sharing, brightness resulted. What I carry from it is not regret. I want to be precise about that, though precision about things one feels is harder than precision about things one observes. The Thessalian pull I can describe with accuracy. The arc, the horse's responses, the quality of gathered versus dispersed light. These have clear properties. What I feel when I think about Pandia is not as clean. She belongs to both the Titaness and the king of Olympus. That is an unusual position. Not comfortable exactly, but unusual positions have their own kind of power. She stands at a particular crossing where two older orders of divinity meet in her. The titanic brightness that runs through my blood, the solar ancestry of Hyperion, and the Olympian authority of her father. I poured my light on her without intending to, that first night I saw her clearly. Not the gathered kind, the free kind. The dispersal that asks nothing of the surface below, that gives without accounting for what returns. She lifted her face. I do not know if she knew. She was below, I was above, and the arc held its usual distance between us. But she lifted her face in the particular way that suggests something received, not merely something falling on a surface. There is a difference, and I have had enough time above the world to have learned to read it. Endymion, sleeping on Latmos, never lifted his face toward me, and yet I always had the sense that my light entered him differently than it entered the surrounding hillside. Pandia lifted her face and held the brightness without flinching. She carries more of me than the 50 do, in a particular register. The 50 are more Endymions. They have his stillness, his rootedness, the patience of someone whose feet rest on actual ground. Pandia has inherited a kind of restlessness, not the anxious kind, the kind that belongs to things that move through the sky and cannot stop moving without ceasing to be what they are. My relationship with Zeus is not simple to name. He is not my enemy. He is not my kin in the way Helios is my kin, born of the same parents, sharing the same long arc of childhood in Hyperion's hall. Zeus and I met in the middle of our respective eternities. He had already been king for a very long time when I first brought a request to him. He will be king for a very long time after this night has passed and been forgotten. What we have in common is Pandia. That is specific and real, a shared brightness made visible in her face when the full moon finds it. The older horse shifts her weight forward slightly, a small adjustment barely perceptible through the reins. She is reading the descent angle, calculating the remaining distance to the western horizon. She does this without instruction. She has made this crossing enough times that the arc speaks to her through her own body, not through my direction. The younger horse follows. Ears still forward, always attending, learning by proximity what the older one already knows in her hooves. I let my attention settle back to the sea below. The light spreads across it now without restriction. The gathering is fully released. Brightness moves outward in all directions from the chariot, no longer pulled toward Thessalian fires, no longer tightened around my form. Somewhere below, Pandia exists in the world. I do not know precisely where she is tonight. This is something I have accepted, the way I have accepted that the 50 daughters exist across the world in their various positions, and I cannot hold each of them in sight. They are scattered like my light, moving across surfaces I cannot always see clearly from this altitude. But on the nights of the full moon, when my brightness is at its fullest reach and the sky holds no obscuring cloud, I pour the light downward without reservation. Not the gathered kind, not the defended kind. That pouring is the closest thing I have to speaking to her across the distance. She holds it. She has always held it without reduction, my brightness arriving at her face and returning to me nearly whole. That return is a rare thing. Most of what I pour outward does not come back. The sea fragments it. The hills absorb it. The sleeping cities take what they need and let the rest dissolve into morning. Pandia returns it. This is not something I planned. A bond does not always announce itself before it forms. Sometimes it is simply the quality of what comes back. The arc continues westward. The sea below holds its particular patience, surface moving in all directions at once, containing the full moon's reflection in its plural. Broken way. Pandia, somewhere below, in her full brightness. The older horse's breath steadies into the long rhythm of the descent's final portion. The thought of the triple nature comes to me now, as it sometimes does on the long descent, when there is little to attend to and the mind finds its own directions. I have been called by 3 names in the same breath. Selene in the heavens, Artemis upon the earth, Hecate in the world below the world. The Greeks understood this arrangement as a single power distributed across 3 realms, one lunar force given 3 faces depending on where it falls. Whether this is accurate, I cannot say with certainty. Certainty belongs to domains I do not fully enter. What I know is this: when my light leaves me and travels downward, it changes. Not in origin, but in effect. Above the clouds, I am what I am. A Titaness, a charioteer, the daughter of Hyperion and Theia, carrying brightness across the dark in a silver vehicle pulled by 2 horses who know the arc better than most gods know their own temples. That is me as I experience myself. But the light that reaches the earth is received by a world that has its own categories. Artemis hunts in forests where my light falls. She has silver arrows and a quiver, and the company of nymphs who follow her through the dark trees. She is an Olympian, daughter of Zeus and Leto, fierce and autonomous and deeply suspicious of anything that seeks to bind her. We share a symbol. We share a colour. The moon's disk has been placed above her brow in dedications and carvings across the whole of Greece. She did not ask me before this happened. I did not grant permission. The association formed itself, the way associations do when two powers happen to operate in the same sphere of mortal attention. I do not resent her for it. Resentment requires a wound, and she has not wounded me. She has simply occupied a space that mortals needed to fill, the moon power that walks on the ground, that chases stags through the oak groves of Arcadia, that watches over young women in the moment between childhood and the life that follows it. That is not what I do. I am above the ground. I do not chase anything. I move in one direction at a consistent pace, and pour brightness downward, and the world receives it as it will. Artemis takes the moonlight from the surface. She makes it active. She turns it into something that runs and hunts and carries weapons. I understand why mortals needed that. Brightness above the world is comfort, navigation, a soft reassurance in the dark. But mortals also needed brightness that acts, that moves among them, that has opinions. Artemis gave them that. And Hecate holds what falls further still. I think of her less often, but I do think of her. She moves through the underworld with her torches, through the crossroads where three paths meet, through the hours before dawn when the boundary between the living and the dead becomes less distinct. She carries keys. She carries what has been learned in the dark. Her light is the oldest kind, the torch held close rather than the arc thrown wide. The illumination of specific things rather than the general brightening of a landscape. If I am the full moon open across the sea, then Hecate is the torch in a room. Both are light. The quality differs. The Greeks put us together because the moon moves through all three realms in its cycle. It rises above the clouds. It falls on the earth. And it goes dark in the nights of no moon into some absence that suggests a place below the visible world. Sky, earth, and underworld. 3 phases, 3 goddesses, 1 principle. Whether Hecate and I share a root, whether we are expressions of the same original power, this is a question I have turned over many times on the long descent and not resolved. She is ancient. Her lineage runs back to Titans, possibly further. There is a gravity to her that I recognize from my own parents' hall, from the way Hyperion moved through his domain with a certainty that predated all argument. The torches she carries are not my silver brightness, but they are not opposed to it. They are the same impulse in a different form, to illuminate, to make visible what would otherwise remain unseen. She does this in small, specific spaces. I do it across the breadth of the sky. The younger horse dips her head briefly. A momentary adjustment, something in the trace of the wind across her face. She raises it again without slowing. The sea below continues its indifferent receiving of my light. The surface divides the reflection into countless pieces. Each wave holds a partial image. None of them together reconstitutes the full disk as it appears from here. This is the nature of fragmented reception. The sea cannot hold me whole the way the sky can. I have wondered whether the triple arrangement serves me or diminishes me, whether being distributed across 3 realms means that the full weight of what I am arrives in none of them. The answer I arrive at, and I arrive at it again tonight with the same lack of finality, is that it does not diminish me. The distribution is not a loss. My light goes everywhere. That I am not present in each place in the same form does not mean I am absent. Artemis running through the Arcadian forest carries something of what I pour across the sky each night. Hecate moving through the crossroads with her torches carries something of the original lunar impulse. What reaches them has travelled through different channels. But it left from here, from this chariot, from this brightness. The older horse's hooves find a different rhythm as the descent sharpens. She knows this part. The final portion of the arc has a particular pull to it, a slight increase in the chariot's speed as the western horizon draws nearer. She leans into it without resistance. This is her knowledge, earned through uncountable repetitions of this same path. The younger horse adjusts to match her, reading the older mare's shoulders, the set of her ears, the angle of her neck against the descending sky. She is learning what cannot be taught in words. The arc instructs through the body, and the body learns through repetition. Artemis will be somewhere below perhaps, moving through her forest, Hecate at her crossroads. And I here, completing this crossing. 3 versions of one light spread across the vertical extent of the Greek world. The sea opens wider as the descent continues. The western horizon is still distant, but no longer abstract. It has become an actual line, darker than the sky above it, a seam where the world folds under. My brightness reaches it now, in the first thin advance of the descent's final light, silver touching the western water before I do. The light touches the western water in a thin silver line, and I watch it arrive there before me. This happens each night. My brightness outruns the chariot. It moves ahead without effort, without the pull of the traces, without the weight of the silver frame. It is the purest part of what I am, the part that needs no vehicle. I have been thinking about the eclipse. Not tonight. Tonight is full and clear, and I am descending without interruption. But the memory comes back in the late hours. In the stretch of the crossing, when there is little to do but hold the reins and let the horses follow the arc they know. The eclipse was a different kind of night entirely. I remember the sensation before I remember the event. A drawing. Something pulling at my light from below, as though the brightness were a cloth and someone had seized a corner of it. I noticed it first as a dimming, not dramatic, not sudden, a slow withdrawal of what I had been pouring across the world without effort for so long. The horses felt it too. The older mare lifted her head, her ears turned back toward me. She was not frightened, but she was attending to something she had not encountered before in all her crossings. The younger horse had pressed closer to the older one's flank. Not from fear, I think, but from instinct. She had not yet learned what this was. She looked to the mare for instruction, and the mare had none to give. Below me, the cities changed. I could see it even from the height of the arc. The light I had been laying across the rooftops and the harbour water was thinning. The harbour that had held a bright reflection of my disk went grey. The silver path on the open sea narrowed and then became uncertain. I heard them before I understood what I was hearing. Drums. Pots struck against each other, bronze and clay and wood. The sound rose from the earth in a dense clatter, uneven, urgent, the sound of many hands acting together without rehearsal. It came from the streets of the city beneath me. It came from the hillsides. It came from the fishing boats that had pulled together in the bay when the light began to go. The Thessalian witches. I had heard of their practice long before that night. The knowledge of it had passed through the divine world in the way that unsettling information does quietly, with a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. That certain women in Thessaly had learned to pull the moon from its course, that they had words and herbs and particular hours in which the boundary of my sovereignty could be pressed against. Feeling it was not like knowing it. The pulling was not painful. I want to be careful here, because the memory is old, and I have turned it over many times, and I cannot be entirely certain what I felt versus what I understood afterward, but my recollection is not of pain. It was more like pressure, like something leaning on the light from outside, like the sensation of a hand not quite touching a surface, but close enough that the air between them is changed. My brightness continued to thin. The disk that I cast, the full open circle of it that mortals had been watching rise and move across the sky for the whole of that night, was being interrupted. Something was coming between it and the earth. Not clouds. Clouds, I know. Clouds pass through me without resistance, and my light bends around and between them without effort. This was different. The shadow moved from one side. I watched it cross the edge of my disk, a curved darkness, deliberate, matching the shape of what it obscured. It was the earth's own shadow, bent by forces those women had assembled in some valley or hilltop in the north. They were drawing it across me, not in pieces, in an arc. The shape of their working was precise in a way that unnerved me, because it suggested that what they were doing had been practiced. The drums below grew louder as the shadow advanced. I understand now what the sound was for. The mortals who heard the eclipse beginning understood it as a theft. Someone was taking their moon. The drums were meant to frighten away whatever force was pulling me down, to make enough noise to drive the working back. They were defending me without knowing how to reach me. I found that difficult to hold in my thoughts then, and still do now. They beat their pots in the streets. They shouted. Sailors called out across the water to each other. Children who had woken to the changed night pressed against their mothers and were told to make noise, to not be quiet, to help bring the moon back. I had not known, before that night, that mortals would do this for me. The shadow continued across the disk. At its deepest, perhaps half of what I am was obscured, not all of it. The working did not complete what it reached toward. Whether the drums actually disrupted something, whether the noise carried any force that the witches had to contend with, this I cannot say. The mechanics of what they were doing remained outside my understanding, but the shadow stopped. And then, gradually, it retreated. The edge of the disk re-emerged on the opposite side, silver and clear, and I watched my own light reassert itself across the harbour water below. The path on the sea returned. The rooftops brightened again. The drums continued for a while, uneven, slowing, and then dropped away one by one as people saw the moon returning and believed, or chose to believe, that their noise had helped. The older mare settled back into her usual rhythm when it was done. Her ears returned to their forward position. She had no framework for what had occurred, and so she let it pass, the way horses let most things pass that do not repeat. The younger horse stayed close to the older one's flank for a long time after. I think about the drums sometimes on the long descent. Not with gratitude exactly, because I do not know what gratitude means between a goddess and the mortals who live so briefly below her, but with a recognition. They saw the light going. They did not accept it. They made the loudest sounds they could with what they had. The western horizon is closer now. The thin silver line where my light touched the water ahead of me has widened slightly as the chariot descends. The sea here is darker than it was at the ark's height, deeper in its colour, quieter in its movement. The far-travelled light has less height to carry it, and so it lies flatter on the waves. The older mare's stride is longer now in the descent. Not faster precisely, but more committed. Each step reaches further forward, pressing into the angle of the drop with a settled confidence. I let the reins rest easy in my hands. She knows this part. She has always known this part. The drums are gone. The eclipse is an old memory. The sky around me now is open and uninterrupted, clear from one edge to the other, and my light runs out across it in every direction without obstruction, without anyone pulling at its corners, received by the sea below in whatever fragmented way the sea receives it. The western seam draws nearer. The sky above it has begun to change almost imperceptibly, not yet dawn, but something in the darkness there that is less absolute than the darkness overhead. The younger horse sees the horizon and lifts her chin slightly, new still. All horizons are still new to her. The night of Pandia comes back to me now, as the western horizon draws nearer and the horses move through the last long portion of the descent. It is one of the memories I return to when the crossing feels long, not because it was without effort, but because on that night I understood, more completely than on any other, what I am. The Athenians had prepared for days. I knew this from the way the city looked before I rose. The streets had been swept. Garlands of pale flowers lined the processional routes, visible from the height of my approach even before the chariot cleared the eastern hills. Lamps were set out on window sills and along harbour walls, not to supplement my light, but to answer it. a city setting out small flames to speak back to the sky. I had seen festivals before, many of them. Cities of the Greek world marked my cycles regularly, tracked my waxing and waning with care, built their calendars around the months I measured. But this was different. This night was named for my daughter, Pandia. Full brightness. The name itself drawn from what I am at my most complete. She came from my union with Zeus, and I do not revisit the particulars of that easily, because the particulars were complicated in ways that have never entirely resolved. But Pandia herself, the festival bearing her name, was something I could hold without complication. The Athenians celebrated the full moon in early spring, the disk at its widest, the light at its most open. They called it Pandia. They meant the light, and they meant my daughter, and they meant me, all three at once. The way names in the old tradition carry more than one thing simultaneously, I rose that night from the eastern water with no cloud anywhere across the sky from one edge to the other. The older mare felt it before I did. Her ears came fully forward as we cleared the horizon, and she held that posture, not the alert attention she gives to unusual sounds below, but a different quality. A kind of readiness. She has carried me on nights of all kinds, and she knows, through whatever knowing horses have, when the conditions are particular. The sky received us without resistance. My light, which usually runs out ahead of the chariot in a long scattering, seemed on that night to move differently, more like a flood than a scatter. It reached the sea below in a wide, unbroken sheet, and lay across the water without fragmentation. The harbour at Athens, which I had passed over on countless crossings, was covered from wall to wall in silver. Every vessel in it became a dark shape floating in brightness. Every rope and spar and furled sail was outlined in light from above. The processions had begun. I could see them moving through the city streets, torch-lit lines of people walking the routes that had been prepared. From the height of the chariot, they looked like streams of fire moving between buildings, the orange warmth of their torches small against the silver that covered everything else. They walked to honour the full moon. They walked to honour Pandia. They looked up as they walked, and I know they saw me because the procession slowed when the chariot passed directly overhead. The lines of people pausing, tilting their faces upward. I passed over the Acropolis, and the stone there was white as bone in my light. The columns rose against the dark sky like something built to receive illumination rather than to shelter from it. Perhaps they were. Perhaps the builders understood that certain materials hold light and give it back altered. The marble did something to my brightness, softened it slightly, returned it with a warmth the sky does not have. I held the reins loosely. The older mare needed no direction on that arc. She ran the highest portion of the crossing with the ease of something she had done beyond counting, each stride steady, each breath even. The younger horse matched her without strain. She had learned the older mare's rhythm by then, absorbed it through proximity, the way younger things absorb the knowledge of older ones, not by instruction but by nearness. The arc of that night felt longer than other arcs, not because time moved differently, but because I was not thinking about duration. I was simply present in the crossing in a way I am not always present, the full disk hanging open above me and below me simultaneously, the chariot at the centre of its own brightness, the world lit from wall to wall. Somewhere on the descent, a memory surfaced. My mother's hands on my shoulders, her thumbs settling the crescent crown into place, her voice telling me what the light was for, not the light as beauty or as spectacle. The light as necessity, the sea navigated by it, the planted fields timed by it, the children born in rooms where it fell through open windows, the dying comforted by it in their last dark hours. Thea told me that the light was not mine, that I was its carrier, not its source, that the source was older than any of us, and I should not mistake the carrying for the origin. I have thought about that often over the years. On most nights it sits in me without friction. On the night of Pandia it felt especially true, because on that night the light was so complete that I could not have claimed it as mine even if I had wanted to. It was simply everywhere. The sky and the sea and the city all awash in it, too abundant for any single figure to own. The torches in the procession below were still moving when I passed beyond the city towards the sea. Behind me, the Acropolis fell away in the distance. The harbour shrunk. The procession lines became too small to distinguish. The city of Athens became what all cities become from this height, a shape pressed into the land, lit by its own small fires, surrounded by the larger silence of the countryside. I watched it recede the way I watch all things recede on the crossing, without grief, without the need to hold it past its moment. The full disk continued to cast its light across the open water ahead. The sea here was wide and uninterrupted, no harbours, no islands visible, just the dark surface receiving the brightness without comment. The older mare moved through the descent arc with her longer stride. Her hooves do not touch anything physical in the crossing, but they move with the character of hooves on ground, deliberate. Measured, following the angle of descent the way a horse follows, a known path down a slope it has descended many times. The younger horse stayed at the older one's flank. She had stopped looking at each new thing individually by that point in the crossing. She was learning, I think, to let the landscape simply be there, to move through it without treating every feature as a separate event. It takes time for young things to understand that passage is itself sufficient. I remember reaching the highest point of the arc on that night and stopping my thought for a moment. Not entirely. I do not stop entirely, but I let the crossing happen without narrating it to myself, without measuring it against other crossings or anticipating the descent. The full disk open, the sky clear to every horizon, the older mare's breathing steady and familiar. The city behind me lit by torches and my own light combined, celebrating the brightness and the daughter the brightness named. That was enough, not as a resolution, as a fact. The disk was full, and I was carrying it, and the world below was lit. The western horizon now is noticeably closer than it was when that memory surfaced. The thin silver line has widened into a pale band where my light touches the water ahead of the chariot's path. Above the band, the sky has begun the first of its changes, not colour yet, but a slight easing of the dark, the way a room changes when a door somewhere distant opens onto morning. The younger horse has her chin lifted again toward it. The younger horse has held that lifted posture for several minutes now, her neck extended, her nostrils open to whatever comes off the horizon ahead. I watch her without correcting it. There is nothing to correct. She is reading what is there. The pale band has a texture now. When I first noticed it, it was a simple line, the edge where my light met the sea. Now it has depth. The water beneath it seems to receive the paleness differently than the open dark behind us, holding it closer to the surface rather than letting it fall through. The sea is doing what it does at this hour, beginning its preparation. I know this hour well. I have arrived at it more times than counting allows, yet each approach carries a small freshness, not surprise, but a kind of wakefulness that comes from moving towards something rather than from it. My hands have settled lower on the reins. The older mare does not need them. She navigates the final arc of descent by something interior, some sense of angle and arrival she has built through repetition into instinct. Her pace has not changed. Her breathing is even. She is doing what she has always done at this point in the crossing, simply continuing toward what comes next. A second memory surfaces now, drawn by the quality of this particular light. Eos rising, not from above, not looking down at her as I sometimes see her from the chariot. This memory is older, from a time when I was younger in my responsibilities, still learning the particular loneliness of the crossing, still measuring my nights against the nights before them. I had descended early, or she had risen late. The margin between us was thinner than usual. I was somewhere over the open sea, when her first colours appeared at the eastern edge of the sky, those reds and golds that she carries ahead of herself like a lamp held out before a walker in dark halls, for a moment. We shared a horizon, not the same horizon. We are never on the same horizon, but the eastern line where she was rising and the western line where I was falling were both visible to me from the midpoint of the crossing, and I understood. In that instant, that we bookend the same world, that there is no sky without both of us, that between my last light and her first colour the world passes through a threshold so brief that most things sleeping in it never perceive the change. That threshold has a name in my memory, though I have never spoken it aloud. It is the moment when the dark belongs to neither of us. When the sky is simply sky, not mine, not hers. Something in that brief window feels true in a way that my full light does not. The world stripped of what we give it, held for a single breath in its own plain dark. Eos does not linger at the horizon when she rises. She moves quickly. Her colours fan outward and upward with an urgency that mine does not have. My light spreads gradually. Hers announces itself. Where I pour, she blazes. We are different in this. We have always been different in this. I think of her now as the pale band ahead continues to widen. She is on the far side of the world at this hour, the eastern sky still deeply dark where she waits. Her colours have not started yet. Or if they have not reached the horizon I am approaching. There is a thin strip between my descent and her rising, where the world rests in a quiet that belongs to neither of us. I am moving toward that strip now. The older mare's ears have shifted. She senses it too, the change in the air that comes as my brightness begins to ease. As the disk overhead tilts toward setting, as the angle of the light stretches itself long across the water rather than falling straight down, shadows lengthen on nights like this, even over the sea. The slight undulations of the surface cast their own faint shadows in the last of my light, a texture that the full middle arc of the crossing never shows. The younger horse has lowered her chin slightly. She is watching the pale band without the earlier tension of the lifted head. Something has settled in her. She recognized it, I think. The horizon is no longer an unknown approach, but a known arrival. This is the learning I cannot give her by speaking. She had to come close enough to know it herself. I think of what Theia told me about the light, that I was its carrier and not its source. And I think there is a version of that truth that applies to the knowing too. I do not carry knowledge to the younger horse. I carry her forward until the thing itself is near enough to be understood. Proximity is the teacher. I am simply the proximity. The reins are loose now, almost ceremonial in my hands, a gesture of holding rather than holding. The older mare needs nothing from them. She has descended this final arc so many times that the chariot follows her without my guidance, the way a river follows its valley without thinking about direction. The pale band ahead has reached a point where it is no longer purely my light touching water. There is something else beginning in it. A difference in temperature, perhaps. A quality of the air that carries the first suggestion of what Eos will bring in an hour. My light is silver. What is beginning at the horizon is not quite silver. Not yet gold. Something between them, unnamed, belonging to the threshold itself. The world below is very quiet at this hour. I have noticed this on every crossing. The middle of the night carries its own sounds, animals moving, water settling, distant ships with their small creaking voices. But this hour, the one just before the threshold, is quieter than any other. Everything that lives and breathes has reached its deepest point of rest, the held breath before morning. I move through that quiet without disturbing it. The chariot leaves no sound in the sky. The horses move through air that carries them without resistance. We cross the quiet the way light crosses a still room, present but not disruptive. My shoulders have dropped. I notice this. Some tension I did not know I was carrying has eased out of me in these last miles, not the tension of effort. Something more like the tension of attention, the slight bracing that comes from holding a full consciousness against the crossing, cataloguing it, remembering it, measuring it. I am letting that go now. The threshold is close. Eos will take the sky from me in an hour, or perhaps less. The older mare will run the last of her descent, and I will let the western horizon receive the disk, and the chariot, and the horses, and the crossing. And the world will turn from silver to what comes after silver. I do not know what I will think about in the hour of the threshold. Perhaps Theia's hands on my shoulders again, perhaps the sleeping hillside on Latmos, where the night air carries the sound of Endymion breathing, slow and even, undisturbed. Perhaps nothing, perhaps only the pale band ahead and the older mare's steady breath and the younger horse's quiet face finally learning what arrival feels like. The disk has begun to set. I feel it in the reins, in the horses, in the slight shift of the light around me as the angle changes. The sky above is still dark, but no longer uniformly so. It holds a softness now, a preparation, like a room just before someone opens the curtain, not colour yet. Or almost, the colour at the horizon has changed again, not dramatically. A small shift, the way a room changes when someone adjusts a lamp 2 degrees. The unnamed band between silver and gold has deepened slightly. More substantial than before. I watch it, and I think of something I have not thought about in some time. There are prayers that no longer reach me. This is the thing that surfaces now. As the disk settles lower, and the quiet deepens around the chariot, not a sharp thing. Not the sudden pain of a wound. More like pressing a hand to a place that has been tender so long one forgets it is still tender, and then remembering. The prayers thinned slowly. I noticed it the way one notices a sound growing distant, uncertain at first whether it is the sound changing or one's own hearing. But it was real. The dedications at shrines that had once spoken my name began to speak another name instead. The offerings left at moonrise shifted in their phrasing, not to Selene, to Artemis. Artemis, who hunts through forests I have never entered. Artemis, who walks on earth while I cross the sky. Artemis, whose silver bow they began to read into my light. As though my crescent crown and her weapon were the same curve. They are not the same curve. But mortals reach for the nearest symbol when the old names begin to blur. I understood this even as I felt it happening. They were not wrong about her. She is luminous in her own way. She carries the moon's power in her stride through the dark woods, and there is something genuine in that carrying. I do not dispute her claim to light. What I felt was quieter than dispute. It was more like standing in a room where people speak of someone who resembles you, and realizing they do not know you are there. The older mare has angled slightly. A small correction, almost imperceptible, drawing us along the final line of descent. She does this without instruction. It is pure interior knowledge, the accumulated weight of 10,000 crossings pressed into her bones and her instincts, guiding her without thought. I let the reins follow her angle. I remember a night, many generations past, when I heard children in a coastal village singing a song about the moon. They used a name I recognized, but only just. Selene appeared in the refrain, but the verses described Artemis's hunts, Artemis's arrows, Artemis's holy places in the pine groves and the mountain passes. My name had become a shell around someone else's story. I stayed above them longer than I needed to that night. I could not have told you why. Perhaps I was waiting for a verse that would find its way back to the silver chariot, the crescent crown, the open sky. It did not come. The song ended, the children scattered inside, and I continued west. The younger horse makes a small sound now, not distress. Something between recognition and curiosity. She has been watching the horizon band for a long time, and something in its colour has shifted enough to register as new information. Her ears turn toward it, then back. I find this easier to hold than the memory of the prayer change. The younger horse is present. The horizon is present. What is happening with the names and the shrines is distant in a way that has grown more bearable over time, though bearable is not the same as resolved. Hecate still carries the moon's fire downward into the underworld. That has not changed. Whatever mortals call us, the three forms persist: sky, earth, below. I have thought of this as a kind of continuity that does not require their naming to remain real, but I will not pretend the naming means nothing. Pandia carries my light at its fullest. Athens celebrated her, and in those festivals there were prayers that reached me directly, unmistakably, with my name intact. I held those nights carefully. A goddess who has felt her name grow quieter knows to hold the nights when it is spoken clearly. The disk is lower now. The horizon band has grown wide enough that it is no longer a strip but a field. A broad plain of that nameless colour spreading across the water, not silver, not gold, holding both without being either. It is strange that the most beautiful part of the crossing is also the part that belongs to the ending of it. Theia once told me that the places where things meet are always more interesting than the things themselves. The edge of the tide more interesting than the sea or the shore alone. The moment of dawn more interesting than either the night or the day. I did not fully understand her when she said it. I was young, and I thought the thing itself was always the point. Now I think she was right. The threshold colour in that band is more itself than any pure silver I cast in the full middle arc. More itself than any gold Eos will spread across the east an hour from now. It is the only colour that cannot exist without both of us, and it exists only for a few minutes, and no one below has named it. Mene, Selene, Celas, brightness, light, the luminous one. My names are older than many prayers, older than the confusion of one loon goddess with another. They do not need the shrines to remain true. They live in the word itself, in the root sound that Greek mouths shaped before the myths were written, before Artemis walked into the forest, and the two silhouettes became difficult to distinguish in the telling. The older mare has slowed fractionally, not stopping, simply gathering herself for the final descent, the way a river gathers before it reaches the sea. I have felt this slowing on every crossing, and it still settles something in me. An acknowledgement that arrival is a thing the body knows before the mind does. The younger horse follows the pace adjustment without being told. She has been watching the older mare for this entire crossing, I think, even when her eyes appear to be on the horizon. Learning is like that. Diffuse and accumulating. You do not always know what you are absorbing until the moment you need to use it. My shoulders are fully dropped now. The last of the attention tension has gone. What remains is something simpler. Presence. The disk overhead, the horses below. The pale field at the horizon that holds everything that is about to change. Somewhere behind me, further east than I can see, the darkness is beginning its last shift. Eos is moving toward her gates. Her colours have not touched the sky yet, but I can feel the air moving ahead of her. The way you feel a door open in another room before you hear it, she will take the sky without asking. She never asks. She arrives. And I will let the western horizon receive me, and the crossing will be complete, and the world will have another day to spend without my light, and another night ahead when I will return. The younger horse has lowered her chin completely now, the way the older mare holds hers on final descent. Parallel. Uncoached. A gesture of readiness that no one taught her. The pale field at the horizon has grown wider still. I watch it from the chariot, from the high point of this last arc before descent. And I think that this is the moment I have been moving toward since the disk rose over the eastern water many hours ago, not the fullness of the middle sky, not the brightness over the sleeping cities. This, the widening of the threshold colour, the signal that the crossing is almost done. The older mare is steady beneath her harness. Her breathing has settled into something long and even, unhurried. She knows this stretch better than I do, I sometimes think. She has carried it in her body so many times that her bones have learned the angle of descent before the eye can measure it. The younger horse keeps pace beside her, chin lowered now. Ears relaxed but not absent, still listening, still learning. I pass over the sea. Below, the water holds my disk's reflection in a long, trembling line, silver pulled thin across the surface, shifting with the swell. Sailors have read that line for centuries, used it to find their bearing when the stars were covered. I did not design it for that purpose. I simply crossed, but the light fell where it fell, and mortals found uses for it that I would never have thought to plan. That is the nature of a gift given without intention. It lands and becomes whatever the recipient needs it to be. I think of Mount Latmos now. I passed over it earlier in the crossing, before the horses had found their deep rhythm, while the younger mare was still adjusting to the particular cold of high altitude. The hillside was dark and quiet. The cypress trees stood like dark stitches along the ridge, and there, in the hollow below the largest stone, Endymion slept. He sleeps still. His chest rises and falls in the same slow rhythm it has held since Zeus sealed the gift I asked for. I lowered the chariot closer than I needed to. The horses did not object. The older mare simply adjusted the angle, accepting the deviation from the standard path the way she accepts most things, without commentary, without resistance. I let my light fall across his face, just that. I did not stop. I did not speak. He could not have heard me if I had, but the light reached him, moved across the planes of his face in the few seconds the chariot passed overhead, and then was gone. The cypress trees returned to shadow. The hillside folded back into its own quiet. I continued west. There is a particular quality in that moment that I have never been able to fully name, not because the language lacks the word, but because the thing itself does not resolve into something nameable. He is alive. I chose that. He will not grow older or feel pain or experience the cold descent into the underworld that all mortal bodies must eventually make. He is held in the last moment of his youth, breathing softly, surrounded by the mountain he tended in life, and I cross overhead once a night. And the light falls, and he does not know. I have spent a long time deciding whether this is a loss or a preservation. I am no longer certain the question is useful. It is simply, what is? The 50 daughters we share move through the world in their own patterns, lunar months counted and recounted, each one a quiet proof that something real passed between us, even without waking knowledge on his part. Love does not always require full presence to be genuine. The horizon band is broadening now across the entire western edge of the sky. I can see it extending from the northern reaches of water all the way to the faint suggestion of southern coastline, a continuous pale field that holds both my silver and Eos's early gold in the same breath without belonging to either. My mother was right about thresholds. I did not always understand it, but I understand it now. The most precise and irreplaceable part of this crossing is not the apex, not the full disk blazing over the midnight sea. It is this, the narrowing, the approach, the colour that has no name because it requires both of us to exist and lasts only long enough to be noticed before it becomes something else. In Athens they spoke my name clearly during Pandia's festival, torches carried in the streets, the full moon invoked with the old syllables. Selene, not borrowed back, not confused with another silhouette in a forest. My name, direct and deliberate, moving upward through the night air toward the place where I was crossing. I held those prayers the way you hold water in cupped hands. Carefully, without gripping. The western horizon is close enough now that I can feel the faint resistance the horses always feel at the final descent. Not reluctance, something more like attention sharpening, a deep breath before the last movement. The older mare exhales slowly. The younger horse does the same, a breath drawn and released in something close to the older mare's timing. The way a student unconsciously begins to breathe in rhythm with a teacher before either of them has noticed. The sky behind me is still dark, but less absolutely. Eos is moving. I cannot see her yet, but the air carries her advance. The cold is beginning its shift toward the different kind of cold that precedes warmth. I know this transition as intimately as I know the sound of my own harness. She will come from the east, rose and amber, spreading without announcement, filling the sky with the colors that belong to morning, and I will have descended. The world will turn from what I made it through the night, this long silver calm that fell over sleeping cities and open water, and one hillside on Mount Latmos. And it will become hers for a while, and then Helios's, and the cycle will carry through to evening, when I rise again over the eastern water, with the crescent crown catching the last of the sun's light. If these hours have settled something in you, if this silver crossing has carried you somewhere restful, perhaps leave a quiet mark of it, a like, a subscription to Olympus Dreams, so that more nights like this one can find you when you need them. The older mare completes her descent. The younger horse follows, and the chariot passes below the horizon line. And the pale field narrows behind us to a seam, and then to nothing, and somewhere on a hillside in Carrier my light lifts from the face of a sleeping shepherd, and the sky above him holds only the remaining dark, and his breath does not change.